Right, so welcome everyone to this first webinar of our disease working group in SLA of this year. I think this is a very interesting and important topic, and of course that's why it was scheduled for today as the kickoff meeting of 23. We're going to talk about fatigue in lupus, and I think for all healthcare providers and all patients, this is a way too common thing we observe and patients notice. I think it's a very complicated symptom or problem in many autoimmune diseases, but I have the feeling that lupus is maybe even more than in general. And the thing is, as many people will recognize, that lupus can be quiescent and still the fatigue can be a huge problem, and we don't have a lot of insights in the mechanisms behind it, let alone treatment strategies. So I think we need a lot of more knowledge in the first place, and hopefully more treatment options to better understand and better treat this, I think, huge problem in lupus. And so today's webinar is focusing on fatigue in lupus within the LEAF framework, and it's my great pleasure to have Lou Kawka and Arnaud from Strasbourg, France, joining us for this webinar. I think two expert speakers in the field. Arnaud needs no further introduction, I think, as my co-disease coordinator for our SLE working group, amongst many other functions that I will not mention today, but I think a very well-known expert in the field. And Lou Kawka, who is a resident in Strasbourg, working in the department of Laurent, and dedicating, I guess, most of her life in the last years on this specific topic, fatigue in lupus. So if there is another expert, that should be Lou, I guess. So I'm very happy to have them here, and I will just share some practical things with you before I give the floor over to them. This webinar will be recorded and published. You will find it through our website and also on the YouTube channel. So feel free to disseminate this also to colleagues and patients who were not able to attend today. We have a Q&A possibility. You'll find it in, well, at least in my screen, in the lower part of your screen. So type your questions there, and I will try to collect those questions, and those questions will be addressed after the presentation. So I will try to keep track on time and leave some room for questions that will probably surely be there. So without any further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and give the floor to Lou and Laurent. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Martin. Can you please confirm that you are seeing our screen properly?
We do.
You do, okay, perfect. So thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Thank you very much to Reconnet. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here today. And just before I start, I would like to say thank you to Lou, who is here today. She was on duty yesterday's night, and well, she accepted to deal about this complicated theme of fatigue in systemic lupus for her MD thesis. And this is a big topic, big subject. So I really want to say thank you for the amazing work she has done. I'm going to give some very general notions about fatigue in systemic lupus. And during a second part of this talk, Lou is going to give you precise results and feedback about the LEAF study we've been running for about a year. So it's really going to be a kind of dialogue, and I hope you're going to find this very interesting. So maybe just to start with our disclosures, I have a few disclosures on the screen. Lou has no disclosures. And if you do not follow our Twitter accounts, please be our guests. Actually, I'd like to start with a little dialogue between a patient with systemic lupus and her doctor. And it starts like that. My dear madam, I have excellent news. You are absolutely fine. and the patient to answer, no, doctor, I am not fine, I have fatigue. And I think we all know what happens here. It's going to be a major breach in the medical-patient relationship, and is really going to be difficult to start again, both from the medical side, but also from the patient side. So we're going to talk a lot about fatigue, but first, maybe something useful for everybody is to try to define what is fatigue. And I think there's something a bit paradoxical about that, which is that everybody has experienced fatigue. I have, you have, but yet there is no consensual definition for fatigue. So this morning I did this little butterfly. I put all the words I found about fatigue. So I'm sure you're going to give me some synonyms, but if I had to ask you for a very specific definition, I think it's going to be difficult. Most people see fatigue as a reversible reduction in physical and or mental capacities, but we understand that this is definitely not a perfect definition. Something really striking to me is that this is a very hot topic. You know that when you make a search on Google, the search is recorded so we can make statistics. And actually, when you look at the proportion of people who make searches about fatigue, it has doubled plus 100% in the last decades. And of course, this is adjusted on the overall Google searches number. So a big increase in the number of searches about fatigue. We know it is multifactorial. There is no one solution to fatigue. Many things can act together, such as lifestyle factors, such as stress, occasionally medication, overwork, burnout, and of course, some physical and or mental illness disease, such as systemic lupus. So I'd like to ask you a question, and I'm pretty sure you already know the answer. Do you know fatigue is the most common and most bothering patient-reported symptom in the context of SLE? So of course, this is true. You have probably been reading this study by Lupus Europe. This was a great survey, more than 4,000 participants from 35 European countries. And as you can see, fatigue is the most common and most bothering manifestation that was reported by European lupus patients. It is also a very common theme on social media. This is a kind of aspiration of the data from Twitter. And you see that fatigue ranks quite high on Twitter when people are talking about systemic lupus. So actually here in Strasbourg, we are a national reference center for systemic autoimmune diseases called RESO. We wanted to understand better the proportion of patients with fatigue and also the cause of fatigue to find ways to help people go better. And so we used a cohort, which is called RBBR. It's actually shared between different centers in Germany and France. And there are data about 1,200 patients. But in this cohort, around 600 patients have filled in some fatigue questionnaires. And unfortunately, the fatigue questionnaire that they filled in is called the FSMC. It's an old questionnaire that was designed for multiple sclerosis. I have not made this choice myself, but as you can see, there are some questions that are very relevant. When I concentrate for a long time, I get exhausted sooner than other people of my age. But there are also questions that are related to multiple sclerosis and not so much to lupus, such as movements becoming less coordinated in the context of fatigue. Anyway, there are official cuts-off, numbers that give different severity of fatigue, and we applied these cuts-off to the cohort I told you about, and we found that almost 70% of lupus patients reported significant fatigue. And in terms of severity, almost 40% of these patients reported major fatigue. So this was very, very impressive. And this was really the confirmation that we waited to understand that there is a strong need to do better. So to treat fatigue, to improve fatigue, we thought, well, we have to understand where it's coming from. And if you follow my Twitter account, you know, I draw that kind of little schemes to combine the different things. We already knew different things were playing to fatigue, but really the idea was to understand the relative contribution of all of these factors. And when you review this little slide with the patient and the doctor, I think that what is actually meant here is that there is no disease activity. The doctor is happy to tell the patient that lupus is inactive. And on the other hand, you see that you can have inactive lupus and still not be fine because there is fatigue. And this is a common problem. So there's really this question of what's the relationship between disease activity and fatigue in lupus. And it's very controversial in the literature. Some studies found associations and other studies do not found the association. In fatty loop 1, we found a significant association, not very strong, but a significant one. For those who knows a bit about statistics, the odd ratio was 1.05 for each point of SLEDAI score. I'd like to quote a word by a colleague from Canada, Zahi Touma, because I think this is an amazing job. He collected fatigue scores, but also disease activity scores during time. And so what you see on the screen are actually trajectories, changes in fatigue and disease activity. And what he showed is that the trajectory for disease activity and fatigue are largely uncorrelated in his cohort. Also, the trajectories who had the highest fatigue scores were those associated with fibromyalgia. And we know that fibromyalgia is actually quite common in the context of systemic lupus, and it can make attribution of pain quite difficult. So this is really a subject to tackle, and there is in systemic lupus a strong relationship between pain and fatigue. For instance, you have this study published quite a few years ago, but showing a strong statistical association between them. The last thing that we really wanted to learn about was psychological manifestations, determinants. And it is true that when you ask lupus patients to rate the severity of their own disease, there is a strong weight that goes to anxiety, stress, and depression. And this is very correlated with fatigue. And indeed, in fatty loop, we found very strong statistical association between anxiety and depression and fatigue. The odd ratios are almost 5, so it's strong association. So that was the first part of the work, and we thought, okay, so there's severe fatigue, there are lots of things that can conquer. Can we find subsets of patients? And we performed a second study called Fatty Loop 2. The idea was to combine the data I just told you about and perform some kind of group-making cluster analysis. It's made using a technique called latent class analysis. And we found 3 groups of patients. The first one, cluster number 1, is a majority, 70% of patients in this LBBR study. They had low disease activity and quite moderate fatigue. On the other side of the spectrum, around 7% of the patients had very high disease activity, and not so surprisingly, these patients had a lot of fatigue. But then we had a very complicated cluster, cluster number 2. Almost 25% of patients, no or low disease activity, contrasting with very high fatigue, very high anxiety, and very high depression scores. And I think we all agree, doctors and patients, that people from this cluster are the most complicated to improve, and we need to find new ways to improve this situation. So now I'd like to talk about time, because we all have the experience of a medical consultation. A good medical consultation takes a lot of time. We have to deal with disease activity, we have to talk about flare prevention, we have to prescribe the treatments, we have to manage comorbidities, to follow, to monitor blood, urine, eye, and so on. It takes a lot of time. And actually, we don't have so much time for something else, which is lifestyle interventions. And I'm a strong believer of this. I think this is absolutely crucial. Therapeutic adherence, smoking cessation. We understand that we don't have enough time. And this is precisely where LEAF is coming in. And now I'm happy to welcome Lou Kawka for the presentation of the method, but also the results of this LEAF study, to which many of you have participated. So thank you, Lou.
Thank you, Laurent. So I am very happy to be here today to talk about LEAF, the Lupus Expert System for the assessment of fatigue. And I am going to show you how we developed it and present you the first results of the LEAF study. So the objectives of the LEAF study were to test the feasibility, the acceptance, and the usefulness of a digital tool to manage fatigue in systemic lupus, but also to describe the main characteristics and variables associated with fatigue in systemic lupus. So first, we developed the digital tool LEAF. So it is an innovative online tool that has been developed in French, English, and Spanish for now, and it has been tested by Lupus Europe. So first, LEAF evaluates the fatigue intensity and characteristics using 3 different scales. So we used a numerical rating scale ranging from 0 to 10. We also used the FACIT fatigue, which is a scale that evaluates the intensity of fatigue and which has been validated for lupus patients. And finally, we used the MFI, which is a scale that evaluates 5 dimensions of fatigue, so general fatigue, physical fatigue, mental fatigue, but also reduced activity and reduced motivation because of fatigue. Then LEAF assesses the potential predictors of fatigue using validated patient-reported outcomes, which are self-questionnaires. So we assessed self-reported disease activity, pain, insomnia, anxiety, depression, stress, physical activity, and fibromyalgia, which was optional. And after that, LEAF provides some feedback and some personalized recommendations to cope with fatigue, depending on the patient's profile. So it does look like this. So here you have some questions about fatigue that come from the FACIT fatigue. So the patients had to enter about the last 7 days. They had to tell how much they feel fatigued, how much they feel weak, listless, and so on. Then we had some questions about the predictors of fatigue. So for example, here about physical activities. So they had to tell on how many days and how much time they did physical activities. And some examples of feedback about fatigue. So about the intensity of fatigue, but also about the dimensions, so physical fatigue, mental fatigue, and about the impact over daily activities. And finally, some feedback about the predictors of fatigue with some personalized recommendation. So here, for example, the patient had a very high level of stress and insomnia of moderate severity. And we explain, for example, the reasons that can affect the quality of sleep and some advice to maintain good sleep hygiene. At the end, the patients had to evaluate LEAF usefulness. So for that, we asked them 2 questions. They had to tell how helpful they thought LEAF was and how likely they would recommend it to another patient on a scale ranging from 0 to 5. And finally, we conducted the descriptive study in which we analyzed the patient responses to LEAF. So the study has been approved by the Ethics Committee of Strasbourg, and of course, the patient had to give their consent. So for this study, the inclusion criteria was a self-reported diagnosis of systemic lupus that has been confirmed by a medical doctor, and the exclusion criteria was an age under 18 years old. So between May and November 2022, 1,647 participants used LEAF. Some did not meet the inclusion criteria, they had other diagnoses, and some had to be excluded. So at the end, a total of 1,250 patients were included in the study. And among those patients, the majority were female with a median age of 43 years old, and they came from 73 different countries, mostly from Europe. Here are the fatigue scores. So with the numerical rating scale, the median score was 7 out of 10. And with the FACIT fatigue, the median score was 21 out of 52. And you have to be careful here because the FACIT fatigue is a reverse scale. So the lower the score is, the more severe fatigue is. And with this scale, there is a cutoff for significant fatigue, which is 34. And with that cutoff, we found that 78.9% of the patients had significant fatigue. With the MFI, the median score were also quite high for the 5 dimensions of fatigue, but especially for general and physical fatigue. And we also found a significant repercussion on activity and motivation. Here is a 3-dimensional graph representing the 3 scales that we use to analyze fatigue, so the numerical rating scale, the FACIT fatigue, and the MFI from general fatigue. And you can see that the 3 scores were well correlated and that most of the patients had severe fatigue. About the predictors of fatigue, we found that their prevalence were quite high in the cohort. For example, more than 60% of the patients had self-reported active disease, significant pain, and high level of stress. More than half of the patients had clinical insomnia. More than 40% had clinical anxiety and low level of stress. And around 22% have had a clinical depression. So we compared the patients with versus without significant fatigue. And what we found is that patients with significant fatigue were most likely to be female and to have higher score for disease activity, pain, anxiety, depression, and insomnia, and that they were more likely to have fibromyalgia and high level of stress. We also analyzed the parameters that were associated with significant fatigue, and we found that the predictors that were independently associated with significant fatigue in multivariate analysis were self-reported active disease, clinically significant pain, fibromyalgia, clinical insomnia, and high level of stress. Clinical anxiety and clinical depression were associated with significant fatigue in univariate, but not in multivariate analysis. About LIF usefulness, more than 90% of the patients thought that LIF was helpful and would recommend it to another patient. And you can see here that most of the patients were very satisfied with a score of 5 out of 5 for LIF helpfulness. So to conclude, as expected, fatigue in systemic lupus patients was frequent and commonly severe, and it was associated with significant reduction of activities and motivation. So it confirms that there is an urgent need to develop new tools to assess and treat fatigue in systemic lupus. Insomnia, pain, fibromyalgia, stress, and self-reported active disease were independent predictors of fatigue, with a high prevalence in systemic lupus patients, so it is very important to assess them. And finally, we showed that a digital tool managing fatigue in systemic lupus, like LIF, is feasible, but also well accepted and considered as helpful by the patient. So it could be useful in general practice.
Well, thank you very much, Lou. This was an amazing presentation. Thank you for the detailed results. I'm just going to conclude by giving general notions about what we've been discussing. What we have shown today is that fatigue is experienced by 2/3 of patients with lupus, and it is severe in about 1/3. Unfortunately, it is reported as the most common and most bothersome manifestation of systemic lupus, even before joint pain. We know that fatigue is highly multifactorial, and this is why it's so difficult to take care of properly. But we found in our cluster analysis that up to 1/4 of patients had very high fatigue scores, but no disease activity. And in those patients, anxiety and depression are typically very high, with a significant confounded factor from fibromyalgia and chronic pain that should be taken care of. Just a conclusion about LIF. We have shown that LIF offers the opportunity to self-assess the predictors of fatigue and provide valuable feedback. And we are working with Lou on the version 2.0 of LIF, which I think will be applied more largely than in the context of systemic lupus, because what we've been discussing today about fatigue is also true for several autoimmune diseases. Before moving on to the questions, and we have saved quite a lot of time for that, we would like to say thank you. First to Lupus for the help, for the detailed comments on the preliminary version of LEAF. I'd like to say thank you to some colleagues, Juan Camilo Sarmiento, Manuel Ugapedil, Mateo Piga for translation and feedback. That was really useful. And most than everything to all participants to the LEAF study. More than 1,500 participants have filled in the questionnaires to help us understand fatigue in lupus. And we really, Lou and myself, want to say thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lou and Laurent, for this wonderful, excellent presentation. I think you really stressed out that this is an important topic, and you already filled a huge gap by giving more insight in the very multifactorial origin of fatigue in lupus, and with a tool that is evidently being appreciated by patients and giving a lot of insight in this etiology. So great work, I think, and congratulations with with this huge accomplishment.
Thank you very much.
And of course, looking forward to version 2.0.
Yes, we are actively working on it. It's a huge work.
Yeah, I can imagine. So this session is open for questions, and we have some questions coming in. And the first one was already asked at the very start of your talk, and it's a bit cryptical, but I think I will understand it. So it says fatigue syndrome in lupus, lupus activity X, I think, versus steroids side effects. So I think somebody here is asking, so what is part of lupus itself, lupus activity, versus what could be related to steroid side effects, which is a relevant question. And maybe I can also add the question: how is LEAF dealing with this? Is it possible to via this tool to discern these two backgrounds, and is there a need to do so, or is it just fatigue?
Okay, I'll take this question. I think it's a very common question we have, such as, is or are corticosteroids responsible for my fatigue? And I must say that in Fatty Loop 1 and Fatty Loop 2, we found a significant association between the use of corticosteroids and fatigue, especially when used at high doses. So I think it's a good reason to decrease the amount of corticosteroids. But there we have to be careful, because you know that when you stop corticosteroids that have been used for a long time, there's a slight risk of adrenal insufficiency, slow adrenal insufficiency, and this can be manifested by fatigue. So I think we always have to keep in mind that, yes, maybe corticosteroids can be associated with fatigue, but stopping them also, and this is why it's not recommended to stop them abruptly.
Yeah, I think that's a very clear answer. Another pressing question, I think, is LEAF adequate for monitoring fatigue? So is it a one-time measurement, or do you see differences in time, and can you use this in your lupus therapy?
Yes, I think it's adequate for monitoring fatigue, and I think that it's one of the point of this tool is that patient can go back to it and follow their level of fatigue, and not only in medical consultations but also at home.
Yeah, great. A follow-up question that also popped up my mind by Arnaud Felton. Do we have any idea if the advices given into LEAF were able to help patients to experience less fatigue? Because in the end, this is what you wish for, right? So one thing is mapping the fatigue and giving more insight.
I think this is a great question, actually. I can give you my feedback, but I'm sure Lou has maybe different opinion. There is one way to prove this formally, which is to make a randomized controlled trial, actually. And I think we will. I think now is a bit too early. We need to develop the V2.0. We've had lots of feedback that we are incorporating, but this is the goal, to show that it works. There is something which is called digital therapeutics. You can actually prescribe online interventions, and they are reimbursed in some cases. And for that, they had to go through formal approval process with randomized trials. So maybe this is one of our aims.
Lou, do you have something to add here?
No, I think Laurent responded.
Yeah, I think you have some maybe data about the feedback from the patient. It could be interesting.
Yes, I think the patients were quite satisfied, and also just being able to talk about their fatigue was already very good for them, and they were satisfied about that.
And maybe a paradoxical question, did you experience patients who were not so fatigued, but by using the leaf tool suddenly discovered that they were really fatigued and that it works the opposite way?
Well, Lou, if you have an idea, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure, but yes, and no, I'm not sure, because also the numerical rating scale for fatigue was well correlated with the facet fatigue and the MFI. So I think the patients that thought they experienced fatigue or they didn't, it was true.
All right. Okay, so the next questions, and there are many questions coming, so that is really good. This is also an interesting one. Could fatigue be responsible or play a role in the worsening of symptoms for some patients? Or is it only a consequence of the disease or the treatments?
This is that
question, I think.
I'd say yes and no. I don't think it can worsen an inflammatory manifestation, but it can make your perception increase, especially in the context of pain. There are lots of data, and we have with LEAF and previous studies show a relationship between pain and fatigue, and definitely being fatigued increases your perception of pain.
Yeah, so it's always the circle, right? Yeah, I can agree with that. Then there is not so much of a question, but an important comment by Matti Stahl, who says, now having more than 20 years with lupus, still have problems to balance between being active and resting moments. And I think this really underlines the importance of your work here, because this is, I think, well, this is something all people involved in lupus, either as patients or doctors, recognize this as a
I can provide just a mini feedback. I think there are two interesting things. First, there's the Swedish team from Karolinska Institutet, led by Yanis Harodis, which is working on non-pharmacological management of systemic lupus or connective tissue disease. So that is the first angle that will bring, I think, interesting data. And also with an international group, we are working on recommendations for physical activity in the context of systemic lupus. And I think this is a way to help. It is a small start, but it is expected in a way.
Then Abdelhamid Hamdi Ramadan asks, can Plaquenil control fatigue?
Yes, there are data showing that there is a positive association between control of disease activity, Plaquenil, hydroxychloroquine, and control of fatigue.
And do we have any idea how this works? I mean, is this a direct
yeah, I think it's both.
disease activity thing?
Yeah, probably, and also some indirect effects at the same time.
And maybe, would it be interferon correlated?
Well, I always say when you have the flu, obviously you have pain, you have fever, but you also have fatigue.
And of course, Plaquenil is, well, amongst many other effects, is targeting the interferon pathway. So, were you probably in your cohort? Most patients had Plaquenil use, right? So there's probably no way to evaluate this in your cohort. Yeah. Okay, so maybe with anifrolumab we can look into this. Would be interesting. Janet Anderson asks whether version 2.0 will be translated into other languages.
The answer is yes. Lou, do you want to make some comments about that?
Yes, it was a lot of patients asked us to have other languages, so we are working on that.
And although this project is a Strasbourg project, not a formal ERN project, I think the ERN framework will be very interesting to discuss this further within the working group to
Absolutely.
see
Our idea is
what
to
the
make
reach
the
could
project endorsed by the reconnet when
Exactly.
it will be finished.
Yeah, wonderful. I think Dutch will be one of the candidate languages. And then Rashid Smiley asks whether there's a correlation between leaf outcome and a particular organ manifestation, such as NP, SLE. And I think if you look at your, in particular, the earlier slides you showed with the emphasis on anxiety and depression in correlation with fatigue, like the third phenotype that you showed in the beginning. This was also crossing my mind. Is fatigue maybe an NP SLE symptom, or well, what's your opinion? And
So
is there a correlation between leaf?
Something important to leaf is that we did not collect detailed organ manifestations because leaf was not associated with a medical visit. It is self-reported. So I cannot answer this question, but obviously there are some relationships.
And then a practical question from Jeanette Anderson. How do physicians use the tool in the clinic?
Okay, I'm giving you my perspective, and I'd be happy to hear what Lou thinks. I think it's always best to talk about these issues of fatigue during the consultation when you can do it. This is not a substitute for medical work that should be done. It's just that outside of the clinic, we don't see our patients every day. Sometimes we see them every 6 months. It's great that there is something the patient can access. But in no way it is like, oh, sorry, I don't have the time to talk about this. Take this paper and connect to leaf. This is not the way we see this.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. And I think that it could be useful for evaluating some predictors of fatigue as the patient-reported outcomes are validated. So it can gain time to evaluate anxiety, depression, for example.
Just to rebound on that, something that is a bit tricky with these subjective manifestations is that if you do not validate them or measure them on scales that are validated, then it remains subjective. And by using leaf, you have precise numbers. And this can be compared from one visit to another visit. This was the question we had before. So this is, I think, why it's so helpful.
But then maybe also a follow-up question on that, because now, as I view it, it's foremost, it's a way to open the discussion to not forget about this very important subject within the shortage of time that we will experience in the outpatient clinic. But do you also, does this already have therapeutical consequences in your practice? Like, does it really lead to prescription of other medication or advices concerning, well, the sleeping hygiene was a good example, I think, but that is already being given by the tool itself. But maybe this is something to discuss. But does it have practical consequences yet, or is this too early and needs more follow-up?
For now, the tool is a research project. So it has to be kept within the frame of research, and this is what we've been doing. This is why it's a very formal presentation of results. Our idea is really to move forward and to get something that is actionable during the consultation before, after, at home, that would be outside of a research project. But this first step was a research project.
Yeah. Clear. All right. And there's a question by Gerard Espinosa. Do you have results of fatigue scores before and after leave performance, and how much time elapsed between when the patients answered the test and when they were asked if it had been useful? So 2 questions in one.
So we don't have results of fatigue score before and after leave because it was anonymous. So we didn't know the patients when they came back what was their first results. So we couldn't compare it. I don't know if it's clear what I just said, but
yeah, it's a clear answer. I think this relates to my question, maybe also if it could work the other way around, right? That if you start investigating fatigue, then maybe people are more aware and will have in the next scoring phase, we'll have worse results, more fatigue, I don't know.
I don't think so. I don't think we are creating fatigue through something like this. I think, on the contrary, that we assess fatigue in a very standardized way, and we are able to provide feedback. I think this is really the goal.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the second part of the question, how much time elapsed between when the patients answered the test and when they were asked if it had been useful?
It was just in the same time.
Same session, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
the same session.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Then a question by Tiffany Peterson, which is not a question, but a comment. Thank you so much for sharing the results of this study. It's a symptom that severely impacts our lives as patients, and it's encouraging to see it being taken seriously by healthcare professionals. So thank you, Tiffany. I think
we are convinced this is a very important theme. As I said, #1 manifestation, most common, most bothering. I think there's a strong message there.
Yeah, I fully agree. And then we have someone from Chile even joining us from Lupus Chile, Gonzalo Tovar Carrizo.
Oh, hello.
So this is very nice and very early, I think, in Chile, right? But good that you're joining us from so far away. And the question is there any difference in the intensity of the fatigue in different ethnic groups? Interesting question, I think.
Yes, it is an interesting question, and I didn't analyze that, but I think it could be interesting to analyze it. So I'm going to do it.
That's good to hear. Do you have a lot of ethnical differences in the cohort?
I think most patients, more than half of the patients, came from Europe. We didn't analyze the ethnic groups, but more the countries they came from. But we can analyze. I think that a quarter came from South America, so we can analyze it. Very nice.
Yeah. So I think that will be much needed extra information. Great. Then there's a question by Suzanne Gideson asking, do you have any idea if patients with depression or anxiety were treated?
So I'm not sure to understand the question, which if they are treated before or when they are performing the assessment, or if following the assessment, if we report depression, they are going to be treated. What I can only say is that during the feedback we provide, if clinical depression is detected, we recommend to seek advice from a medical doctor. In no way the idea with LEAF was to substitute to medical doctors. We always ask patients to be referred to us and discuss this with the general practitioner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then we have a question from Emma Cartwright, and I'm skipping all the thank yous, but there is a lot of thank yous in the Q&A. So, but for sake of time, we will leave that. But the question is, do you have any insight into the direction of correlation between anxiety / depression and fatigue? E.g., is it possible that debilitating fatigue and impact on function can lead to anxiety and depression rather than vice versa?
Mm-hmm. I think that in the little schematics I draw, I put a double head arrow because obviously it's bilateral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, would it be possible to evaluate this closer?
I think this is a bit complicated. Multivariable analysis shows us the association that is independent, but then the precise direction, there are techniques for that, but the study was not designed for it.
Mm-hmm. Because in the end, if you think about treatment options, then of course, it makes a huge difference whether you emphasize the depression and the anxiety as a treatment possibility or the fatigue itself or lupus activity. So,
but I think we need to treat all of this actually if there is a medical indication.
And two questions by Christelle Felix. How are patients recruited and how can patients be aware and participate in LEAF 2.0?
So we shared the link to the LEAF website on the social media and also with the patient associations. But you can still try LEAF the first version on it's still available on the internet, and for the LIF 2.0, I think we are going to share it on social media too, so you can follow us on Twitter, for example.
Great. Another question by Christelle, is Leaf able to capture how much of ratified rights is due to insomnia or issues with sleep? So I think it means that how much of your results are influenced by primarily insomnia or other sleep issues. It's possible to discern this.
Lou, do you want to answer that?
Insomnia, I think insomnia was the most important predictor of fatigue. So it is the odds ratio, it was a higher odds ratio. So it was a very important predictor, a very strong association.
And I think there's a very important clinical message here, is that not so often we ask our patients about the quality of sleep, whether they are having nightmares. There's a beautiful paper in Rheumatology about that, asking nightmares. Maybe we should focus more on these aspects.
There's another question by Abdelhamid Hamdi Ramadan, and it says steroid dose medications for lupus patients with chronic fatigue. So I think it means is there space for steroids to treat fatigue? Or
I don't think there's a space for steroid to treat fatigue. It's just through the control of disease activity. If disease is active, we are going to treat disease activity using any validated strategy. It may include corticosteroids, but as I said before, we found in Fatigue 1 an association between corticosteroids and fatigue that was independent for severe fatigue.
Yeah, and might there sometimes be an indication for methylphenidate in those patients?
Yeah, it's been discussed quite a few times, but this is obviously not assessed through LEAF. But I've seen some nice publications about that.
Okay, so then there's a question by Tove Petersen. Lou, speaking about stress, any special kind of stress or stress in general?
No, it was stress in general. We didn't, the tool we used, it assessed stress in general. It wasn't a specific stress.
Yeah. So this is a broad concept, right?
Yes, I think it's difficult to assess a specific kind of stress.
Still, I think it's important because some people, some patients, they may feel not so good and not know that this is actually stress. So by using a calibrated scale, we can provide a result, which is your stress is more than 75% of the general population, 95%, 99% of the general population, it's higher. That's the kind of feedback we provide.
All right. And there's a question by Carlos Vasconcelos, again about the monitoring of leave. Would you agree to use this every consultation? Would that be helpful, or maybe only once a year, or what would be your aim if everything is validated and not only in a research protocol?
My perspective is that, so this is research, but outside of a research perspective, the tool is made for patients, and I think patients can access it when they feel the need to use it.
Yeah, so you would leave it up to patients. Yeah. All right. And then Carlos also adds that he would like to participate, or Portugal would like to participate in the next leave if possible. So that is good to know.
Muito obrigado, Carlos.
Then there's another comment by Matty Stahl stating that balance is also difficult because lupus is in every part of her body.
So, do you want to make a comment, Lou, about fibromyalgia, widespread pain, and?
Yes. So I don't know if everybody knows about fibromyalgia, but it's a condition that is often associated with lupus and with fatigue, and it's characterized by diffuse pain, chronic pain, not only in the joint, but all the body. So maybe it can be why you feel like...
And with LEAF, a section of the assessment is dedicated to fibromyalgia. We detect whether the patient fulfills the criteria.
All right. Interesting question by Dominique van den Berg. Can you somehow compare lupus fatigue to other forms of fatigue like cancer-related fatigue? And going from there, can we use the possible treatments in cancer-related fatigue to treat lupus fatigue, for example, endurance or strength training?
So this is a question about physical activity, and the answer is yes. There are a few randomized controlled trials. The level of evidence is not very good, small numbers of patients, but yet a significant association between physical activity and improvement of fatigue. And so this is why we are leading an international task force on this to provide very specific advice to perform physical activity in psychiatric lupus.
And there's a question by Nassim Sabri that I think we tackled already. Is there any link between fatigue and neurolupus?
Yeah, I think we have answered that it may be a manifestation between other things.
And then there's a comment by Heather James. I was diagnosed in 21, so this is still new to me, but fatigue is a huge problem for me. I still don't know when I'm having a flare or not, as I'm in so much pain and fatigue. Thank you very much for this. I'm learning a lot along my way. So again, I think this underlines the importance of today's webinar. So thank you, Lou and Laura. I think it's very clear again that this is very good to have this webinar to address this.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here today. So
then Marta Morato Villa, is leave giving or will leave give information recommendations to reduce the fatigue? If yes, where the information comes from? Yeah, that is a good question, because it will be always depending on each patient, he says. I think this is true. So there is an advice you showed us in some slides that LEAF is not only detecting the fatigue, measuring the fatigue, but also trying to give some advice, for instance, the sleeping hygiene.
Yeah, sure. I can answer this very briefly. For instance, for physical activity, there are some international recommendations. So LEAF does not provide general advice about fatigue, but if you have insomnia, it's feedback to talk about your doctor about insomnia. The idea is not to substitute the medical doctor or the general practitioner. It's just to pinpoint what are the problems, and then the patient should seek some advice, dedicated advice for these problems. But it is in no way, for now, a medical substitution to medical consultation.
No, but I think also the question by Marta goes to the fact, so there is some advice. It's not a substitution. I think that is clear. But the advice that comes, is this evidence-based advice that has references and scientific background, or is it more like common sense knowledge about?
I think it's both. It depends. When there is evidence, we use evidence. Physical activity, there is a bit of evidence.
Yeah.
But stress management in systemic lupus or sleep improvement patterns, the literature is not so good.
All right. Another question by Abdel Hamid, but I don't really understand what he's asking. In lupus patients with positive anti-CCP, question mark.
I don't know.
Maybe he refers to lupus patients, whether this is a different group and fatigue is a different problem in this group. I don't know if there are anti-CCP positive patients in your cohort.
This is not assessed by LEAF. What I can say is that it takes care of the pain and whatever is the cause of pain in a way. So the feedback is provided.
Yeah. And another question by Abdel Hamid, can vitamin D replacement, if deficient, can manage fatigue?
There are a few data. It can help. I think if there is a deficiency in vitamin D, it has to be corrected anyway.
Yeah. well, in my experience, this is also really something that I always measure when in every patient actually, but when a patient is fatigued, I at least try to to replace the vitamin D, and sometimes it really works, and sometimes it doesn't. That is a problem. Then Jeanette Anderson with a nice comment. Thank you for doing this great work. It really means a lot for patients to have their experience of fatigue validated. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I fully agree and understand the comment.
Yeah. Question by Nuria Serrano. As there are several determinants of fatigue, like poor sleep, depression, etc., do you think fatigue is properly assessed in clinical practice? I think you already alluded a bit to this.
I'm convinced it's not the case.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, and I think the LEAF tool will really be helpful to tackle this. Then a question by Kirsi Millis. I have both SLE and Sjögren's, and fatigue is also linked with Sjögren's, isn't it? I think it is. There's no way to tell which one is the cause. And I think she's very right here.
Lou, do you want to answer this?
Yes, I think it's difficult, but also fatigue is multifactorial. So maybe there is both lupus and Sjögren's, and maybe also, I don't know, other predictors that are responsible for this fatigue. So it's difficult.
Important with LEAF is that we are not really focusing on lupus or Sjögren. This is actually why I think the V2.0 will be deployed in inflammatory rheumatism. What we assess are the confounders: depression, anxiety, stress, physical activity, insomnia. And this is where it brings something, I think, not in the assessment of the disease itself.
Yeah. And I think then two other questions that are coming up are follow-up questions on this. Do you include comorbidity in your investigations? Suzanne Geidesen asks.
It's the same question in a way. Not really.
And Heather James, is there any research on hormones and fatigue?
Yes, there is. Yes, there is, absolutely. But the results are not so convincing about substitution of hormones, especially sexual hormones. The exception is hypothyroidism, which is quite common cause of fatigue, association with Hashimoto and lupus, so it has to be searched, of course.
Now we come to the final question of our webinar. 1 minute left. So Jeanette Anderson asks, thinking of prior research and showing that physical activity can help fatigue, are you planning to use this tool to show that? Excellent question.
I think that there are data showing that physical activity improves fatigue. What we can say is that people who designed randomized trials, they can incorporate LEAF in the assessment and see whether the scores improve. But I don't think that's the goal of LEAF. Would you agree, Lou? Or?
Yes, I think I don't think this tool, with this tool, we can analyze if physical fatigue, if physical activity help fatigue, but.
Okay. There's another question coming up in Swedish. I think I don't understand the question, unfortunately, and I think we also need to round up because it's 6 o'clock. So maybe Laurent, I think your Swedish is really good, so maybe you can still answer this final question by typing.
But I'm not sure what it is.
Hopefully. But anyway, I think we had an excellent session. First of all, I would really like to thank Lou and Laurent for giving us this beautiful overview of new data. And let me stress this is unpublished data largely, and I think a very important tool that will hopefully reach all our clinics all over Europe in different translations. A lot of work to be done, but a lot of perspective. And as we have seen in many comments today, everybody agrees this is important. So thank you for all the work, and thank you for this beautiful presentation. Thank you, ERN Reconnect, for facilitating this webinar, because without that, we wouldn't have the opportunity. And of course, thanks for all the people who were here with us today, asking all the questions and listening. And I would like to conclude with mentioning that we will have another webinar next month, and also the month after. You will get notified by the PISA team beforehand. And wishing you all a good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you back.
Great having you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.